This week we have something a little different, a little pre-Christmas special, if you will. Our chief political correspondent, Paul Sakkal, is here with me in Sydney, and we have a former Prime Minister in the studio with us. He has just written a book on Australian history called Australia, A History, and he's been spending a lot of time in the United States. He's just flown in from the United States, where he is on the board of Fox Corporation, amongst other things. Tony Abbott, a very big welcome to Inside Politics.
Jacqueline, lovely to be with you and Paul.
Now, I have before me your tome on Australian history. It's 400 pages-ish. You're a known Anglophile and you're obviously a big patriot. But few people, I think, would have expected you to write a book about Australian history, particularly a book about the expanse, the entire Australian history. What made you want to do it and add to the canon?
Well, two reasons. I thought it was a more worthwhile project than the standard former politician thing, which is to write your memoirs. And I absolutely accept that memoirs can be a valuable addition to our insights into what's happened, but they do tend to be a little self-serving, and I thought that I had best let my time in politics be dealt with by the historians rather than try to rehash it all myself. Second reason, I think we have a history to be proud of. It's not perfect, but it's much more good than bad. And I think too much recent Australian history has focused on the downside. Now, maybe to some extent that was a corrective to the old Three Cheers version that Geoffrey Blaney refers to. But I really do think the pendulum swung way too far to the other side. And one of the reasons why I think Australians aren't really studying our own history much is because they instinctively know that the history that produced a country as good as ours can't be all bad, and yet when they delve into it, it does seem all bad. So they think, well, let's block it out and let's just look forward. But a country which does not appreciate itself and does not understand its own past finds it difficult to adequately understand the present or to build a good future for itself.
I really enjoyed the opening chapters on colonial history and the history of colonial Sydney, and you sort of put a slightly different cast on our convict past and make the point that the convicts actually, in many ways, had a better lot than the underclass in Britain, or certainly people languishing in prisons in Britain. What do people misunderstand, do you think, about that period of history?
Robert Hughes's very widely read and magnificent book, The Fatal Shore, has coloured our perceptions of that time. Now, it's true that the punishment centres, Port Arthur, Norfolk Island, Port Macquarie, Moreton Bay, were pretty horrific. But about 10% of the convicts ended up in places like that. For the big majority, they got here, they were assigned to a master. For many of them, it was just like working in a pretty normal job, because let's face it, that was the only labour force, or most of the labour force we had back in those days. And so, yes, there was the minority experience of the fatal shore, so to speak, but much more the majority experience, which I stress in the book, is of convicts writing home to their kith and kin in Britain saying, I am actually having a better life here than I would have had in London. It's interesting, Peacock, the colonial artist responsible for the dust jacket illustration, he was a London lawyer who was convicted to hang for forgery. It was commuted to life transportation. He ended up at Port Macquarie, one of the hellholes of the fatal shore. His wife and family joined him at Port Macquarie. They decided they would rather go to Sydney. He got a transfer from the administration at Port Macquarie, and he became, if you like, one of the weather officers at the South Head Weather Station. All this happening while he was actually on a ticket of leave, and he became one of our best colonial artists and an early meteorologist, as it were. So, I mean, this redemption story characterises our early existence. I mean, these were people who were given a second chance at life, and most of them grabbed it with both hands and succeeded magnificently.
Obviously, the cohort of the population that didn't come off so well from colonisation was the Indigenous population. And you deal with the massacres in the book, and you do take your lead from historians who've covered those extensively. But your spin on the relations between the early colonisers and Indigenous Australians is a bit different and a bit more positive than recent times. Tell us about that.
Well, two points to make. The first is that officially there was this constant stress on the fact that the Aboriginal people of Australia were British subjects with all the rights of British subjects and needed to be treated fairly and properly. That's certainly not what happened routinely on the frontier. But even on the frontier, it wasn't all oppression, massacre, etc. Most of the explorers needed Aboriginal guides to get them through the territory that was unfamiliar to them but was very familiar to the local Aboriginal people. The pastoralists invariably needed Aboriginal men to work their herds and Aboriginal women to keep the households going. So it was a story of cooperation and partnership as well as a story of conflict and confrontation. So again, I just think we need to see the good and the bad, and we need to be very careful about judging those times by the standards of these times. They were just much tougher times. Whether you were a Marine, a free settler, a convict, or an Indigenous person, they were just tough times. And what we find shocking was routine in those days.
It strikes me, Tony, that the reason you wrote this book is tied up in a lot of senses with the current malaise of the Liberal Party. There's a sense that you're out of step with a lot of kind of where elite opinion is formed in universities, in schools. Conservative opinion, in your view, is marginalised. What's happening in modern society that means the Liberal Party is so out of step with the culture?
Well, I think the culture is out of step with reality in important respects, and that certainly is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, perhaps the main reason why I wrote the book, because I just wanted to correct the misapprehensions that so many people seem to take for granted about Australia's past. But look, I've occasionally, probably more ruefully than anything else, Paul, accepted that I am a bit out of step with the temper of these times. I mean, I don't think there is a climate crisis.
We'll get to that.
I don't get this whole trans push. I certainly don't accept the magic pudding economics. I was appalled by the virus hysteria that we lived through for a couple of years. And yes, I certainly don't accept the cultural self-loathing which seems to characterise not just Australia but much of the Anglosphere right now. So yes, the book is in a sense my pushback against all of this. And I guess if we're moving on to the Liberal Party, Paul, I wish my party, the party I still wish well and want to succeed, I wish my party were a bit more robust in its approach to things, and I'm pleased to see that under Susan Lee it does seem to be adopting a slightly more robust approach.
Isn't that a difficult position to be in, though, that you're basically accepting that you're outsider, that you're against sort of mainstream culture in a few different respects? And the Liberal Party is also having that problem in the sense that it just doesn't seem to reflect mainstream Australian values. And we can see that very clearly at the ballot box. I mean, isn't there an arrogance to a political party that says we're going to stay here and we're not going to evolve to the mainstream culture? We're going to stay where we are and we're going to fight and belligerently stand our ground until everybody comes around to us. Isn't that anti-democratic?
Well, Jacqueline, obviously in a democracy you want to win votes rather than alienate voters. But I also think you've got to engage in a conversation with the public which is respectful but occasionally perhaps robust. I mean, I've always seen the job of political leadership not as asking the voters what they want and giving it to them, but asking yourself, what does the country need, and trying to persuade voters to vote for it. For instance, when I became opposition leader back in late 2009, everyone thought that I was doomed because I didn't share the consensus that climate change was the greatest economic, political and even moral challenge of our time. What I think I succeeded in doing over 2 elections was persuading the public that there was an economic dimension as well as a environmental and perhaps moral dimension to climate change. And I had an unexpected swing to us in 2010 and a massive swing to us in 2013. And I still think that if you look at the record of successful governments, Hawke and Keating and then Howard and Costello, and then perhaps to a lesser extent myself, it is possible to persuade the public. Look at The Voice debate. At the beginning of the Voice debate, some 60% of the public were in favour. In the end, some 60% were against. And that's because a strong and consistent and I thought principled argument was mounted. And again, I stress the job of political leadership is not to reflect what the focus groups tell you. The job of political leadership is to discern what you think our country most needs now and try to persuade the public to vote for that.
You said at the CPAC conference, I think earlier this year, that the Conservative supporters there should give the Liberal Party one more chance to win back their faith. And you strike an optimistic tone on the Liberal Party in the book. You say that all parties, even in their most parlous positions, are 1 or 2 great leaders away from coming back to life. Do you think the Liberal Party is in this existential moment where, because of the fracturing in the centre-right and the new ways people gauge information and the new ways people engage with politicians, there is a chance that the centre-right doesn't hold and it's inevitable that we see a Nigel Farage-style third force in Australian politics? Or do you think the Liberal Party can hold that ground?
We just don't know what the future holds. And plainly, previous iterations of the Australian version of the centre-right have failed. I mean, Deakin's fusion Liberal Party disintegrated during the First World War. The Nationalist Party disintegrated during the Depression. The UAP disintegrated during the Second World War. So we have no God-given right to continue to exist as the main centre-right party as Liberals. I mean, we have got to lift our game to better address the problems of the day and better appeal to the public. But I do think we have a better chance of doing that than any alternative that I can see. When I was rolled as Prime Minister, I had hundreds of letters and emails from different people saying, "Oh, Tony, why don't you start your own political party?" And apart from the fact that I think it would be churlish of someone who had been put into the Prime Ministership by the Liberal Party to then dump the Liberal Party just because the Liberal Party had decided to put someone else into the job, I also wrote back to these people invariably saying that it's much easier to fix an existing political party than it is to start a new one. And while I accept that reform in the United Kingdom is doing very well, I don't think you can assume, even on the basis of their current very strong polls, that that's going to be translated to an election win. And Nigel Farage is a remarkable politician. He's been on the scene for a long time, and but for Nigel Farage, Brexit would never have happened. And I think that shows a degree of resilience, a degree of insight into the issues facing Britain, which I don't think any of the potential alternatives have shown in this country. I have a, I'm not anti-Pauline Hanson. I think Pauline Hanson, in her second incarnation as a member of Parliament, has been responsible. I think she's often been quite constructive. But it's one thing to mount a reasonable critique of where things are at. It's another thing to be a credible alternative government. I don't think Nigel Farage is succeeding, and I certainly don't think that at this point in time One Nation is succeeding.
How do you take on
respect.
Hanson? What's the strategy there?
Well, look at what John Howard did. I mean, when Pauline Hanson first came to prominence, saying that too many Australians were feeling like strangers in their own country, government was letting people down, too much money was being wasted, Howard very shrewdly resisted the urge to personally attack Hanson, would from time to time, where necessary, politely disagree with her, and did his best to address the real grievances that her supporters felt. And over time, the Howard government did restore prosperity. Howard's great achievement over the course of his government was to actually make Australians feel relaxed and comfortable about ourselves and our country, because he didn't pursue those divisive agendas, republicanism being just one, that characterised the Keating government, for instance. So I think the way to respond to Hanson today is not to be hypercritical of her, not even to be too focused on her. It's to look at the things that are causing our problems. Now, I do think that there's an insanity to our current energy policy and to our current emissions obsession. I do think there's deep folly in what is effectively out of control mass migration at the moment. I do think that we need to take better charge of a whole range of cultural institutions which seem to be going off on really...
What do you mean by that?
Well, look...
How can a government take charge of cultural institutions, and why should it?
Well, a government needs to express a strong view. I mean...
Give us an example.
As a conservative, I don't think that government should be directing institutions other than those that are immediately the responsibility of government. But I think government's more than capable of providing a lead. For instance, why wouldn't senior ministers be able to say without any embarrassment or hesitation that there are only two genders? I mean, why is that such a problem? Why have so many politicians got themselves into absolute knots and twists about this?
Do you think that's a big issue for Australians? So you're talking...
It's not something that the average Australian obsesses about. But if your teenage kid comes home from school and suddenly announces that he is a she or she is a he...
Well, they come out as trans.
Then it does suddenly become a huge issue. And I absolutely accept that if, as an adult, you've wrestled for years maybe with this issue and you want to go down a particular path, that's your right. But this idea that schools should be, in a sense, encouraging gender fluidity, and this idea that cultural institutions should be promoting this kind of non-binary identity, I just think it's slightly strange. And again, I think it's the job of significant national leaders, whether they're the chairman of big companies, whether it's the head of the ABC, whether it's members of parliament, premiers, prime ministers. You've just got to stand up for common sense.
If you acknowledge that, you said earlier that you don't think this is a top order issue for people, although some would have strongly held views and be quite shocked if their kid said that to them after school, which I accept. Why should the Prime Minister or business leaders spend any time talking about this if it's not a top order concern?
Because, as Reagan said of the presidency, it is a bully pulpit. And as both of you would know, if you are a premier or a prime minister, or even a senior minister in a government, every time you have an encounter with the media, you are questioned about whatever the topical issues of the day are. And I do think that our leadership has a responsibility to be prepared to express a robust, common sense view.
Sure.
Now, that doesn't mean that you've then got to devote your
Every
whole
day.
life to being a culture war warrior, because in the end, what people expect of government is to try to ensure that the economy's well managed, to try to ensure that government is efficiently run, to try to ensure that the country is as safe as it humanly can be. But that doesn't mean that you should opt out of these things, particularly if there are a whole lot of currents pushing society in unusual and even somewhat strange directions.
Could it be that the responsibility also swings the other way, and that if you have the bully pulpit, as you say, you have a responsibility not to inflame these issues? And isn't that something that also should be a consideration for politicians?
Well, I think it's important to treat people with respect. And again, this is one of the other problems. In a more fragmented and polarised society, I think there has been a regrettable tendency to assume that people who disagree are not just misguided or misinformed, but in some way bad people. And I think this is most unfortunate. But again, I just think it's very important for leaders at every level to say what they mean, to do what they say. And if you see something significant which you think is seriously out of line, rather than just ignoring it, I think you should politely deal with it. In the same way that if you're walking down the street and you see something happening that shouldn't be happening, like the vandalising of a car or the harassment of a woman, you can't just walk past that, or you shouldn't walk past that. And if you're a leader, you've got a moral duty to do the best you can to stop bad things happening.
You talked about the US presidency being a bully pulpit. How is Donald Trump handling that responsibility well, do you think?
Well, look, I think domestic Trump is pretty good. I think foreign Trump has done some good things and some things that I wish he hadn't done. I like to see exercises of American power directed against people who are doing the wrong thing. So I was pleased to see the American attack on the Iranian nuclear installations. I accept that you've got to be incredibly careful that you don't make mistakes, but I don't have a problem with American forces taking out drug-running boats.
Even extrajudicially?
Well, look, the Obama administration certainly launched lots of kill strikes on suspected terrorists. Sometimes got it wrong, but they certainly did that. And I don't think there was all that much moral outrage about what the Obama administration tried to do. And I think that there should be the same, I guess, level of understanding applied to the current administration as was applied to the former administration.
In the foreign sphere, you've been a big supporter of Ukraine and its war with Russia. You famously said you'd shirt front Vladimir Putin. Infamously, famously, I don't know which term you'd use. Do you worry that China is watching Trump's manoeuvring on Russia and Ukraine?
Absolutely,
and considering it in relation to its thinking on Taiwan?
Absolutely right. I mean, you know, the democratic West is currently challenged by, if you like, an axis of autocracy, whether it's the militarist dictatorship in Moscow, the communist dictatorship in Beijing, the apocalyptic theocratic dictatorship in Iran. And these challenger powers are working in a kind of loose concert not because they have all that much in common, except for this, their deep dissatisfaction with the Anglo-American global order, which has dominated the world for much of the last 2 centuries, but particularly since the Second World War. And there is no doubt whatsoever that as part of the No Limits partnership, the declared No Limits partnership between Putin and Xi, if Putin in the end prevails in Ukraine because the West refused to support this country fighting heroically for its
not the
freedom
West,
and independence.
just the US, really.
But of course, part of the problem is that even Britain and France are now reluctant to do anything without American support. I mean, Sir Keir Starmer, I think, quite properly announced earlier in the year that once a ceasefire was in place, there would be a British-led stabilisation force in Ukraine to act as a tripwire against further Russian aggression. But he said, but we would need an American backstop. When the American backstop was not immediately forthcoming, he suddenly started backpedaling. Now, I think it's sad, frankly, that a country like Britain is not prepared to act independently here.
But sorry, just back to your point, if Russia was to prevail and you were going to continue on to how China would act, I'll let you continue with that.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that China would take that as a sign of Western weakness, and in particular of American weakness, or at least of an American pullback from the wider world.
And what could the consequence be in terms of the Indo-Pacific?
Well, if America were to pull back to its own hemisphere, that would allow China to dominate Asia, and most likely Russia to dominate Europe. And if our world were dominated by China, over time it would be a very different and I think much worse world than it has been up till now. I mean, the long Anglo-American ascendancy has changed the world in the Anglo-American direction, more free, more fair, more rich, more safe. A Sino-centric world would change everything in a Chinese direction. And much as I love Chinese people, Chinese governance is much more... it's much less conducive to individual freedom.
Sorry.
I just go to Vance?
Yeah, I was just going to go to Vance. You met with J.D. Vance, Vice President J.D. Vance, on a few days ago in the United States. Is that something you discussed with him? Look,
we had a great talk. I'm a big fan of J.D. Vance. I think he's a very, very impressive human being, and I would encourage anyone who wants to get a handle on J.D. Vance to read his outstanding book, Hillbilly Elegy. I won't go into the detail of what we discussed. One matter that I have been raising on and off in the United States ever since AUKUS was announced, and all credit to the Morrison government for announcing AUKUS, and all credit to the Albanese government for continuing with AUKUS. The problem with AUKUS is that we need more naval strike power now. And yes, let's get Virginia-class subs in 8 or 10 years' time, and let's get the AUKUS subs in 10 or 15 years' time. But wouldn't it be good to get a nuclear-powered submarine now? And given that the Americans are retiring a couple of LA-class nuclear-powered submarines every year, my curiosity is, why couldn't Australia take over one or two of these boats now and run them for a few years as Australian ensign-flagged boats? Because it's nearly always possible to extract a few more years of useful life out of these vessels, and why not do that? Because we really do need more firepower now, because as everyone says, a crisis across the Taiwan Straits could be much closer than a decade away.
So is that something you suggested to JD Vance?
I'm just not going to go into the detail.
But you brought it up in
Jacqueline.
that context.
Take it as a yes, I think.
I will take it as a possible yes. I want to ask you just lastly about something, because we're running out of time, unfortunately. I feel like we could talk for a lot longer. I read, in reading around last week about you, I read a piece in The Australian from a few years ago that you wrote a letter of recommendation for Julia Gillard for her recommendation for an Order of Australia, a companion in the Order of Australia, which of course she was awarded. Is that true?
Look, I honestly don't recollect it, but
do you just dash these letters off all the time?
But I certainly thought she was an appropriate awardee, and I have written a lot of letters over the years in support of people getting an award. And one of the points I make in the book is that Gillard was a very capable politician. I mean, she was the Shadow Minister for Health when I was the Health Minister. She was the manager of opposition business when I was the Leader of the House. She was Deputy Prime Minister when I became Opposition Leader. She and I, for several years, did a Friday morning joint discussion on the Today program with Carl, and she's an impressive person, and certainly she's been really exemplary as an ex-Prime Minister. She's occasionally said things that she thought needed to be said, while at the same time immersing herself in various good work. So if I did write a letter, I'm pleased. And if I didn't, I certainly think that she's a worthy awardee.
How do you reflect on that time now? I mean, times have changed a lot, and it's certainly the way that we talk about gender and sexism in public life. She, of course, accused you of misogyny. She wasn't the only person to accuse you of misogyny at that time. Do you think it would be acceptable now, for example, for a party leader to stand in front of a sign that says Bob Brown's bitch or ditch the witch, that kind of thing? Do you regret that?
Well, Jacqueline, as you might remember, at the time I was completely unaware that those banners were there. I mean, they were, as far as I'm aware, erected behind me after I'd stood up to speak.
Yeah. I'm still, I guess the question still stands, whether you regret any of the commentary, any of your behaviour, any part that you might have played in the perceptions and the hysteria around that time and the undeniable sexist treatment that Julia Gillard was subject to.
Well, I often used to observe that back in the day, the parliamentary chamber was not fair to female members. I mean, I can remember when Carmen Lawrence used to stand up as Health Minister. I thought there was a nasty dimension sometimes to the barracking that she got. By all means, Jacqueline, point to something that I did or said, which was an example of sexist misogyny, because I honestly think you'd struggle to find anything.
What I'm asking, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm asking is whether in your time reflecting, because it was now 10 years ago plus, in your time reflecting whether or not you would do anything differently, or how you reflect on all of the commentary and all of the sort of reflection we've had on the sexism in politics at that time. And I'm not talking about your behaviour necessarily, but I'm talking about the media commentary. You know, Alan Jones, who's a friend of yours, famously was horrendously sexist towards Julia Gillard.
And he apologised.
Sure, but I guess what I'm asking is, how do you reflect on that time now?
I mean, look, occasionally people say things in the heat of the moment that they regret, and when that happens, you should apologise. And Alan, to his credit, did apologise for those observations, which were silly, they were over the top, they were wrong, and likewise. I'm just trying to think back to anything that I might have said or done at the time. I don't.
There's the sex appeal comment. There's the daughter's comment. I'm just trying to recall my mind back.
I mean,
there's the women doing the ironing. There's a couple that come to mind.
Well, I suppose these These were.
Julia Gillard should make an honest woman of herself.
I think they're pretty innocent. I think they were fairly innocent observations, maybe tactless observations. In the Abbott household, when I was growing up, I'm afraid Mum did the ironing. It was as simple as that. And I think even now, it's probably true that in more households than not, it's the woman that does the ironing, to the extent that we do any ironing these days. What was the other thing I said wrong, Paul?
Oh, there was the sex appeal to Fiona Scott.
Oh, yes.
There was commenting on your daughter's appearance, which I think people found maybe slightly weird.
You said that Julia Gillard should make an honest woman of herself. I mean, there's a list of these things, but I suppose
if Julia Gillard had said Tony Abbott should make an honest man of himself, would that be a sexist observation?
I doubt it would be seen that way. But
no. See,
but that's not how gender. There's the imbalances on the other side.
I mean, look. Let's. I just think we can just get overexcited about these things. I mean, I believe that in my adult life, I have always treated women with respect, and I have, as far as is humanly possible, tried to see people as people, not as female, male, black, white, Catholic, Protestant, Australian, non-Australian. I've tried to treat people as people, and to look for the good in them.
I really just want to get these couple of last questions in. Despite your what you described as some tactless comments, I think in talking to people before this podcast, I've described to them your position in kind of conservative circles, both in Australia and in London and in Washington and other places. You do hold, it seems to me, this kind of special status as the leading Australian conservative. Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton don't command the crowds you command at Conservative Party conferences in London and other places. I've seen some of this myself, the way you get mugged in crowds. You're still also highly active in factional politics. You engage with internal politics and just the general affairs of the Liberal Party in a way that most of your predecessors don't anymore. What's the mission that you're on? Why are you still so engaged, and what are you driving at?
Well, I think John Howard has been no less involved in the party.
Probably just due to age now, you're right.
And John certainly is, I think, quite appropriately regarded as the greatest living Liberal. In some respects, perhaps the greatest ever Liberal. And I think he's been altogether a force for good in the Liberal Party in his post-parliamentary time. And I guess in this respect, at least, I would want to model myself on John Howard. I want my party to succeed. I want my party to be its best self. And I think it will succeed best and be its best self if it is a robust alternative to Labor. If it is liberal in the sense of wanting smaller government, lower taxes, greater freedom, if it is conservative in the sense of respecting the family, small business, institutions that have stood the test of time, but above all else, if it is patriotic, because I think Australia is the best place in the world to live, and I desperately want us to stay that way.
You've acknowledged, though, that some of the views you hold are potentially out of step with mainstream Australian values. Are you fighting, some of your colleagues who served with you feel like you're fighting the battles of your prime ministership, that you're driven by a sense that you still have work to do because that was cut short in the way it was?
I don't think we should run our electricity system to reduce emissions. And I think a whole lot of those chickens are in the process of coming home to roost. I do think we need to get government spending under better control. I do think we need to encourage a greater sense of personal responsibility. And I do think that Australia should be better prepared to defend itself if needs be, and to make a contribution to defending freedom in the wider world. So I don't think these issues really ever change, Paul. I mean, I think the circumstances change, but the fundamental imperatives don't.
Very, very finally, your keenness to contribute to public life, I didn't realise extended to before the last election, actually having conversations with people about running in a seat before the May election. I've heard from people close to Peter Dutton that there were conversations about running for a Senate spot, for Macarthur, for Parramatta. All of these things were floated, and you were keen and expressed this view to the former opposition leader.
I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration. I had one conversation with Peter Dutton after it was publicly suggested that I could possibly take Jim Molan's Senate seat. And Peter basically said that it would make his life more complicated if that were to happen. I completely accepted that. Now, different people said to me, "Oh, Tony, why don't you have another go?" And my view then and now is that I couldn't or shouldn't do anything that makes the life of the leader of the Liberal Party more complicated. And
can you see a path back where it doesn't make the leader's life more complicated? Is it in prospect in some way?
Look, I've got a lot to do as things stand, Paul. I mean, I've got a book to promote. I've got a couple of other book projects, at least.
Couple of book projects
in my mind.
What are they?
Let's get them further advanced before we start talking about them in public. But
we'll plug every one of them.
But
Tony,
thank you. I appreciate that. But I think the best thing that people like me can do in normal political circumstances is be as encouraging as I can be to the coming generation of Liberals. And just as I want the Liberal Party to be its best self, I want my, Liberal successors to be their best selves, and I'll just keep doing that to the best of my ability.
Tony, you've been so generous with your time. Unfortunately, we have to let you go. You do have a book to promote. I would encourage everyone to buy this book for Christmas presents. It's actually a really good read, and that's for people who maybe wouldn't even be natural fans of Tony Abbott or might not have voted for him. We do have an extraordinary history, and he's laid it out in beautiful, lucid prose. Tony Abbott, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Thanks, Paul.